This is Lynn Elkins of IBM's Washington System Center. This short presentation is the second one about buffer pool statistics from the MQ SMF data. This is an overview of the topics we're going to cover in this session. I'll also talk at the end about some of the tuning options you can use to manage your buffer pools. In the first presentation on the buffer pool statistics, I spoke about the primary information fields and the major problem indicators that you use for primary buffer pool analysis. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the rest of the fields in the records and how they can be used. The fields that I'm covering in this session are in bold red on this page. QPST-IMW is the count of immediate writes to the page set or page sets associated with this buffer pool. This may indicate that the pool is too small, or it may be that pages are being written out because they've been in the pool for 3 checkpoints. Another cause for non-zero IMW counts is when a message is being put and the message is larger than the number of pages available in the buffer pool, and that's what's shown in this particular example. When the buffer pool being examined is designated for responsiveness-driven work, often real-time request-reply scenarios, then the pool needs tuning if the IMW count is non-zero. If this pool hosts batch-oriented work, a non-zero IMW is acceptable as long as the numbers are fairly low. QPST-WIO is the number of write requests during this interval. This is another "it depends" field. Buffer pools hosting long-lived messages will typically have a non-zero count here. Buffer pools hosting short-term messages should not be written from the buffer pool to the page set if at all possible, so I would expect the count to be 0 for those buffer pools. QPST-RIO is the read IO count. The queues and their workload type that are held within this buffer pool, whether it's batch or real-time, drives whether or not a non-zero count is acceptable. Another important note, there will be non-zero read counts for many buffer pools following a queue manager restart if there were unprocessed messages on the page set during the shutdown process that preceded this restart. The read and write I/O counts give the full picture of I/O that took place during this interval. The rate can be calculated by the total number of I/Os, that is the total of the read and write operations, divided by the interval duration. The interval duration is in the general record header area preceding the buffer pool statistics. If the I/O rate is high, then adding an additional page set to the pool and dividing the active queues across the page sets provides for at least the possibility of parallel I/O should it be needed. As a reminder, if there is a lot of I/O, then having the buffer pool above the bar and page fixing it can reduce the CPU costs and improve throughput as well. QPST-STW is mentioned in the Knowledge Center as part of an I/O efficiency calculation, but the field itself is not defined. It is the count of pages that are dirty. They have data on them and they are slated to be written by the deferred write processor. Frankly, for the purposes of performance tuning, I generally ignore this field. Like the overall I/O rate and the I/O efficiency, these numbers tend to make me look deeper into the accounting data so that I can do a better analysis of whether or not there is a lot of contention within the buffer pool that can be relieved by moving queues to different page sets or to different buffer pools and their associated page sets. Altering the location of highly active queues and or queues that have become very deep can improve efficiency of the queue manager by providing for parallel I/O in the event of writes and reducing contention within the queue manager when there has to be allocation of additional control blocks for those really deep queues. The buffer pool SMF data doesn't tell you which queues are defined that use this pool. That requires that deeper level of information that only comes from the task accounting data. You can't really make a rational decision on queue placement or queue movement unless you have that level of detail. QPST get-in is the count of new pages requested, and QPST is the count of old pages requested. They're typically used together and can indicate workload behavior patterns, in particular when queues are being scanned for messages. Scanning for specific messages is done when there is a match option used on an MQ get and the queue is not indexed, or when the message properties are being used for message selection, or when queues are being browsed. Scanning can be expensive, especially when scanning for matches, in both CPU and time. One indication of possible scanning is when a get for an old page is done repeatedly, so the ratio of get old pages to get new pages is very large. Because this data is at the queue manager level, it can't tell us which queues might benefit from indexing or being searched or browsed like this, so queue level data from the accounting trace may have to be reviewed to see if the scanning can be eliminated by using a proper index on the queue. If the scanning is being done because of a browse or by searching for a message selector, it may not be possible to eliminate. Just controlling the cost by keeping the queue depth low is the target there. Another thing to note, the message CSQI004I is produced for queues that are scanned due to a lack of an index, but that's only reported in the JES log when the queue depth is greater than 100. QPST TPW is the total number of pages written to a page set. This can also be an indicator of scanning when compared with the read I/O count, and it's an even more expensive kind of scanning, one where you're doing actual I/O, because the messages have been written to a page set and are no longer available in the buffer pool. Hopefully you will be able to avoid this. The last two fields are all about stealable pages, and they are used when you need to read a page back from the page set into the buffer pool. So the first value is the QPST STL field, and that's simply a count of the stealable pages that have been used. Again, it is a value where you need to know something about the workload that is using this particular buffer pool to determine whether a non-zero value is an issue. If the pool is for short-lived messages and the value is not zero, then you probably want to start tuning that buffer pool. The second field is the STLA field, and that is the count of the number of times there has been contention for a stealable page. Again, if this particular buffer pool is for short-lived responsiveness-driven messages, if you have a non-zero STLA count, you need to look into tuning that particular buffer pool. If this is for a batch workload and the STLA value is 20% or more of the STL count, then you do need to look into resizing that as well. By the way, that 20% count is just my rule of thumb. You may find in your environment that you can tolerate more or less. So we've finished with the fields in the buffer pool SMF data for MQ. Now we're going to talk about a few of the suggestions that we make on tuning the buffer pools and when you might want to try them. Buffer pool tuning is not a one-size-fits-all tuning exercise. The first step that we often recommend and that we often do is just to make the pool larger if there's available storage. Sometimes that helps. Sometimes if the problem is not just the size of the buffer pool, it doesn't. Also, sometimes when you're trying to make the buffer pool larger, you actually have to move it above the bar. There's a lot more storage there typically, and in fact, you may be able to host an entire 64 gigabyte queue, and that's the maximum page set size, in a single above the bar buffer pool. I don't necessarily recommend that, but it can certainly be done. Another thing you can do to help tune a buffer pool is once it is above the bar, then you might be able to reduce CPU and increase throughput by page fixing the buffer pool. That is most beneficial for buffer pools where there is a lot of I/O going on, but it can help, and some customers have reported that it has helped with other workload styles as well. Finally, you may have to move queues around. Moving highly active queues to different or new buffer pools, splitting up request-reply queues, that can reduce internal contention. And this can be especially helpful if you have other queues within that buffer pool that are getting deep. Buffer pool tuning has been known to reduce the response times to acceptable levels by avoiding unnecessary I/O and reducing CPU costs for non-persistent messages. I have seen examples where the request-reply patterns went from multiple seconds during a peak period to less than a quarter of a second with just taking the first step towards proper buffer pool tuning. In addition, avoiding I/O can reduce the CPU consumption substantially as well. This has been the second presentation on buffer pools, and I'd like to thank you for your time and attention to this. It's probably not the last you'll hear on this topic, as there's always more to learn, and I am already thinking about a couple of advanced buffer pool topics. You can find the PDF of this presentation on the IBM-WSC GitHub site. It has all of these pages and a useful links page. This is Lynn Elkins of IBM's Washington System Center, and I always look forward to hearing from you. I can be contacted at elkinsc@us.ibm.com. Thank you again.